This is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I'm the fellow who has a hyphen in my name. The hyphen is silent, but I am anything but that. Well, democratically speaking, it is a good day. That means that we can be quite open-minded about whether it's the morning, the evening, or the nighttime. I suppose we could let everybody in on a secret and actually tell everybody it's a gorgeous, beautiful, I was going to say May morning. It's actually April, but it is gorgeous. Bright sunshine and so on.
It is beautiful.
So what we have today is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley, and I'm joined by my co-host, Sarah Benton. I am the voice of Respectonomics, and today we're tackling a subject which I have actually been a little surprised at by the number of people who have said to me, yes, we need to hear about this. We want to know more. And the subject is called burnout. And if you look at my notes, and if you look at the summary of this podcast, you'll see that it reads burnout in brackets, not. So with that kind of, what would you call it, complicated beginning?
Yes.
All right, I'll make it straightforward. Let's talk. What's that? It's food for thought. It's food, which I think actually raises an important point. Everything we do at Respectonomics is designed to be extremely, intensely personal. It's not you, me, anybody telling anybody anything, but it's for allowing people the opportunity to look within themselves and maybe to experiment, maybe to take hold of new ideas, but it is very personal. And the reason I'm mentioning this is on the subject of burnout. This is an area that can get us into some extraordinarily intense areas where therapy is required, where psychological analysis and so on. That is not, certainly speaking for me, that is not my calling. All I'm doing, I believe, is holding up a mirror and asking people to take a peek and see what they think and what it looks like to them. But I'm very emphatic that technical support, professional support, you take your computer to a technician, you take your car to a technician, there's every reason to say then we should be able to take ourselves to the technician who can look after us psychologically or mentally or physically.
And whatever venue that is.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. Very personal again. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Although I hope in my expression of this, what you're hearing, and I hope our listeners are hearing, is my advocacy for third-party help.
Absolutely.
Trying to fix things on our own has become, either it always was or it has become, I don't know which, has become impossible, I think. So getting external help, I think, is very valuable. So
yeah,
shall I rest my case on that point?
You can rest your case on that point.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. So now we'll get on to the burnout discussion.
Yeah.
And the first thing is, when I say there's no such thing as burnout, the reason I say that is because if you were burnt out, you would not exist. There would be possibly a shell of bones and skeletons and whatever, and might be a bit of clothing, I suppose. But really, the burnout would say you have been extinguished. And that is not true. It's a critical point. If you go to where there's been one of these ghastly forest fires,
yeah,
and you see the houses that have been destroyed, part of you will say the house is destroyed and will need to be replaced. That is a truth. But I think it also engenders another principle, which is that the damage that has been done is in fact retrievable. And by that, I mean, you can build a new house, you can move your location, you can change your lifestyle. I'm not condoning it in any shape or form, naturally. But all I'm pointing to is it's not a full stop period, you can't go past go. There's a sense that something can be done about it, however painful, but it can be done. I think when we're looking at burnout, what we really realistically are looking at, there are three categories I want to share with you and our listeners. And the first one is that when we talk about burnout, I think what we're really referring to is parts of our lives that have burnt out. It's a compartmental kind of approach. Not everything is burnt out. I still go to work. I still get onto the subway. I still do things. So I'm not burnt out physically or mentally, but I am burnt out in certain areas of my life. And those burnt out areas become dominant in my life. But here's the crucial point. Now, this is a very male perspective, but I have a feeling it's more prolific than we care to perhaps even admit. And that is this. If there's been a loss in our life, so if there's an area of my life that has been burnt out, has been destroyed,
Yes.
that is a loss, straightforward.
Absolutely.
But the truth of the matter is, do I grieve over that loss? Have I recognized it as a loss? And have I, in fact, put into motion the whole character of grief? Because I know from a male point of view, and I'm going back to childhood days, I'm going back to colonial British, whatever you would call it, probably nothing very favorable, really. But if you think about it, we were told not to grieve. It's not manly. Do not shed a tear.
Right.
And I think we can all come out with horrible examples of it. But what I'm getting at is the concept of grieving is a very important part. And if we haven't grieved, and I didn't know this until very recently, that in the ancient tribes, you had your warriors.
Mm-hmm.
I always thought, I don't know about you, but I always thought warriors were there with big shields and big swords and big everything, and off they'd go to battle. Well, apparently the real warrior was not entitled to be thought of as a warrior or considered a warrior unless he knew how to grieve.
Interesting.
Very interesting.
And on that point where you were talking about you may not have necessarily recognized it for the specific instance, or you were told not to.
Yeah.
I think the important thing to know or to think about is that grief that may have been allocated to a specific situation or scenario or environment that will have trickle over effects into other arenas.
Absolutely.
Actually, be
yeah. I mean, I think grief needs to be compartmentalized, and I'm sure that's really the right word, but it needs to become product specific. It's totally acceptable to grieve. There are different parts to grieving. I was told recently, I was asking a friend about whether I had grieved over something properly. His answer was very interesting. He said, well, your somber response says, number one, that you have grieved or you understand what it means to you. So it's not like you come to the table with a giggle.
Right.
You say, oh, I lost that, and somehow trivialize it. No, it's a very somber, it's a very solemn moment, actually, to accept one's grief.
We don't always grieve in the same way either.
That's true. Absolutely. This isn't meant to be this isn't meant to be a one cake for all. This is more to do with the idea that I think the somber response is probably across the board, I think.
Right.
Although I agree with you entirely, how people do it is different.
Right.
Secondly, though, there's a degree of acceptance, to accept the loss.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that sounds almost like, easy for you to say, but there's a point in one's life when one knows one has lost something, one has come to grips with it, if you will.
Right.
But you are now or I am accepting it.
Or it could be acknowledgement even.
Exactly. I think
acknowledgement of it, you may not be quite at that space of acceptance.
Exactly. But the third one, though, that really helps to bring it all together and to give you a sense of have you dealt with this or not, is the sense of hope. Because if you don't come to the table with the hope, then I would think axiomatically the process of grieving really hasn't taken place the way it needs to follow itself through, however you do that. But there's nothing, I don't think we can do anything more cruel to a human being than to take away hope. So I think looking at it another way is this grieving process is important, and it's something in a sense that we should encourage. And let people grieve and let them understand there has been a loss and it is to be grieved over.
The space.
Exactly. So that's the sort of the general background on burnout. But I want to bring you to two other points here about how do we deal with it? Because, and I'm going to use, believe it or not, I'm going to use electricity as the denominator. And electricity...
As the conduit?
Okay, you've used a very big word. Well done. Don't say armature, and don't say brushless. Come on.
No comment.
No, I'm not going to make any either. But what I will say is this, though. Electricity depends on two things. it depends on the source of the electricity and it depends on the use of the electricity. I mean, source and application, if you will.
Right.
And here's something really interesting about the source of electricity. Electricity is generated, yes?
Yes.
Okay. And if you go to one of those huge generators up at, say, Bruce Nuclear, and they're huge, great things, and they're whirring away. But here's an interesting truth. If that generator, excuse me, if that generator is not under load,
Mhm.
it will actually burn out.
Interesting.
I always thought a generator could just whir away and nobody was using the electricity and that would be that. But if you think about it, it's producing something. It's a bit like water. The water has to go somewhere. The
Mhm.
electricity has to go somewhere. So that what you may be looking at in this example is, in the case of burnout, is the sense that you've got this incredible whirring going on. And people who express burnout say, I feel like I'm just whirring out of control.
Right.
And one of the things may be that, in fact, that energy that's within one or has been brought to one, that energy needs to be put under load. So while you look over the whole spectrum of, I can't do anything, I'm out of control, I don't like myself, all the burnout phenomena, one of the things that's interesting would be to take something that matters,
Mhm.
it's important, and to create it as a load item for the energy that you already have.
Would you consider that displacement?
Um, I don't think it's actually displacement because that we will be talking about. If you could hold that.
Allocating?
Hmm? No,
The
it's more.
alloc
Yeah, this is just saying we have this power. It needs to be put under load. It needs to be worked. Diesel engines work very well under load.
Mhm.
Generators blow up if they don't get under load. So all I'm pointing to us as human beings is I think we're designed to carry load.
Mhm.
If there's too much load, which we'll come on to. But the load I'm talking about is to find a project that you actually believe in, that you want to get your teeth into. You know,
And you
and
feel that this will help with the burnout where we've got the overload?
I'm not even going to say it helps with the burnout, but I think it might be one of those things that gives the burnout a completely new perspective
Okay.
and makes it more manageable and so on. I think, in other words, we have this extraordinary energy, and if it's not being used, it's being wasted.
Mhm.
And what's that expression? Use it or lose it, or lose it or use it, whatever that expression is. You know, in other words, give ourselves the opportunity to take on a task or a project or a mission, whatever it might be. And I think it can be literally anything. It doesn't have to be corporate. It doesn't have to be community. It might be, I'm going to read a book every day.
Change the way you think about things, and the things you think about will change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So okay, so there's the generating part. So I've got all this power within me, put it under load. And I don't mean 10 different loads, that's ridiculous. But what I am pointing out is take a mission, take a subject that you're really interested in and bring it home.
Mhm.
Number one. So that's that one. But the other one is, and I'm not sure which affects people. I have a funny feeling it's both of them, actually.
Okay.
I think all of these things have a sort of, we put them into convenient little brackets. Well, actually, the brackets all interconnect anyway. And you find out what's going in one place is going on in another, and the list goes on. But the point is, here's one thing. If you have too many, have you ever taken a receptacle plug, whatever you call it, receptacle, and plugged too many things into it? Have you ever
Maybe.
done that in your life?
Maybe.
Just possibly, maybe, because we all exactly poof. Exactly. And what happens is, of course, is because the circuits are being required to produce are under too much load.
Mhm.
So what actually happens is the circuit breaker flies open.
And it requires a reset.
It requires a reset. Now, the catch, though, is, as you know, with any circuit breaker, when the circuit breaker goes on in your house and you go racing down to the basement and you flick the switch, most electricians will say, not so fast, Charlie, because what they also want you to think about is there some circuit that is creating
Yep.
resistance or problem? That's why it's actually going off.
Right.
So, although you say, I agree with you about resetting, I think it's a very good opportunity to look over all the activities that one's involved in, all the draws on on one's energy, in other words, and to find out which ones are maybe irrelevant or not important or can wait or maybe cancelled altogether. I'm not sure there's a one-line answer there. But I think looking at one's activities, whether it's going for a bike ride, whether it's going to work at 6 in the morning, whether it's putting the children to bed at night, all of these things are demands on your circuits.
Right.
And if your circuit doesn't have enough strength in it to state I think the obvious, then something has to be cut out so that the power can now be equitably and usefully distributed.
And so in terms of from a respectonomics vantage, can you take us through that correlating to body, mind, and spirit?
I think that, first of all, one of the key behind respectonomics is to understand the dignity of the human being. And we kind of explicitly talk about the dignity of the other human being. Actually, the one that matters more than anybody else is oneself.
Right.
That is
Correct.
where the dignity begins and ends. And when you talk about burnout, it's quite realistic that there's been a part of one's life that has not been dignified appropriately. And that might be another way of saying, less politely, you haven't been paying attention to something.
Right.
So respectonomics, as you know, is very, very keen on the concept of awareness. The awareness of us as human beings and this incredible capacity that we have and the sovereignty we have and the flexibilities, the reflexes. I mean, the list goes on. They're incredible. The thing is, when you talk about the body, mind, and spirit, I think it's a very good question to each of us when we're wrestling with this burnout, whether we need the load or need to reduce the load, whichever way it is, whether we need to grieve, whether we need to be in a place of hope. There's a very good calling, a very sensible calling to dignify your body. Dignifying your body has wonderful attributes in both your mental and spiritual sort of capacity. We've said before many a time, actually, we have said mens sana, corpore sano, which is from Lucretius. I knew you knew that.
Of course I do.
But, healthy mind and a healthy body.
Absolutely.
Having a healthy body is, in fact, when you talk about burnout, take a look at the body and see whether it needs to be dignified, or if it has been, that's great, that's wonderful. And then you talk about dignifying the mind. The mind is a trap for all of these confusing signals that we get from politics and from economics and jobs and, you name it, the children racing up and down the stairs, whatever it might be. Our minds, you use the word reset. Mm-hmm. Our minds also need to be dignified.
Right.
Take a look at your mind and the incredible capacity it has to remember, to think, to reflect. It's incredible. You get tired of me talking about Latin and Greek.
I never said that.
Well, you should, because everybody will agree with you. You're meant to be a co-host. You're meant to be looking after the people. The answer is, though, that the advantage of looking at your mind in terms of its reflective ability, in Greek, there are 17 different words for the word think. I say, I think something or other. The Greeks would come back with, well, do you mean to reflect, to consider, to assess, to articulate, and all these varieties of on the theme. Right. The point I'm getting at is taking stock of the dignity we've given to our minds is very valuable. And the last one, it always gets us into this sort of territory where people say, well, we won't talk about that, which I think in itself is a mistake. And that is that if you think of the human being as tripartite, you think of us as being made up of three parts, the body, the mind, and the spirit or the soul, the fact of the matter is the soul or the spirit needs to be dignified. I often think of the soul as our operating system. In other words, you look at your body as your hardware, you look at your mind as your software, but you know something, hardware and software will never work if you don't have an operating system. So having an operating system that works is achieved by dignifying one's inner soul, one's inner sense of spirit. One of the creeds to respectonomics is to honor other people's freedom of choice.
Mhm.
And I think that's unbelievably, I don't know if essential can ever be modified, but it is absolutely essential to when people are looking at that great reservoir, which is their soul, that
Yeah.
they are the ones who can look to see what pieces are needed, what flows are needed to go in. But I'll tell you one thing about a reservoir. When I talked about it being a reservoir works on the principle of something coming in and something going out. It's usually water.
Yes.
Water comes in, water goes out. And that's a very, very important dynamic to the way in which our souls are fostered, the way they are nourished, is to understand that we are going to nourish them, but that nourishment is designed to go out to other people. And that's where we've cornered the market on this issue, that the more I dignify somebody else, the more I dignify me.
Tell me about counterblocking.
Counterblocking is a fascinating exercise because what this does is you take an activity you do not want to do.
Yeah.
The classic example is I do not want to call a customer. I mean, that's the one. But it could be as I don't want to talk to my supervisor. I don't want to talk to my subordinate. I don't want to. I don't want to. I don't want to. And the
Mhm.
world is full of don't want tos.
Correct.
And one of the things is you're not allowed to say that. If you say to somebody, I don't want to do that, you immediately get the pushback. Why not? Why not? What's wrong with you? So it becomes a very difficult thing to admit. So counter blocking says, first of all, write down on the piece of paper what it is that you don't want to do. So
Okay.
I do not want to call the chairman of General Motors.
Okay.
I don't want to do that.
Why? Is that the next question that happens?
This is where counter blocking is very interesting. What we've done there is to make a statement.
Right.
We've made a statement that counter blocking we've made a statement of, I don't want to do that. So I am now admitting to myself, that is how I feel.
Right.
So you write down, I don't want to call so-and-so or whatever it is. And then underneath that, you write down 25 reasons why that approach or why that thought is in fact irrational.
Mm.
That's what counter blocking means, because it's counter what is in fact blocking you. I don't want to do something.
And do you
Now,
think that
sorry,
helps burnout?
what's that?
Does this help with burnout?
Absolutely, because what it does is fascinating. Because when you write down 25 reasons why you don't want to, no, you don't want to call somebody, but now you're writing down 25 reasons why that is irrational.
Right.
So the first one is, I promised I would call him. The second reason is, my colleagues expect me to call him. And as you go through this list of why it's irrational, what you actually come down to is right at the very end, the 25th reason is usually the real one.
Interesting.
The first 24 are, I wouldn't call them superficial, but it's as you get to the bottom of the list, you really start finding out what is holding you back. But by approaching it in a way very positively, because what you're saying is, I've got this negative thought, I don't
I'm
want to do
validating
something.
my thought.
Yeah. But now what I'm doing is, why is that irrational?
Mm.
When you do that, I can tell you personally and authentically, by the time you've got to the 25th reason, you can't wait to pick up the phone.
Interesting.
So when you think of burnout as being something that paralyzes people or suppresses their activities, this is a wonderful way to set oneself free. And you are doing it to you.
Right.
I'm not doing it to you.
Right. And one last point to talk
Mhm.
about in terms of
Yeah.
burnout. I know it's something that you've mentioned before in terms of rebuilding through guilt. Tell me a little bit about that.
I think the problem of going through burnout, as we call it,
Yes.
the problem is things get left by the wayside. And one of the problems is, as we come back with using some of these approaches and getting some help and so on, and awareness and what, we experience guilt. We
Yes.
experience, I really should have dealt with this before.
Right.
And I think, again, there's two ways of dealing with that. understand that there's going to be a guilt. Just know that coming back isn't going to be a smiley, sweetie, everybody loves you kind of experience. As
Yes,
we come back, I'm sorry?
acknowledgement
Acknowledgement.
or
And I
acceptance.
think with that, you can grieve over some of the things that didn't get done. And I think we can also go to the counter blocking to recognize there are things that we want to do, that we should be doing, somehow we can't. Now we're going to take them in hand. But the guilt, I'm only making a point. The guilt is something you can experience. And I'm not sure there's quite frankly, I don't think there's a sweet answer to that other than to say, yeah, we do go through guilty times.
Yeah.
And guilt is a terrible, terrible stain on one's ability to move forward. It holds you back. So the sooner you can deal with your guilt, which can either be done mentally or spiritually, whichever way however you want to handle it, but handle it.
And the interesting thing I find about guilt is it's a learned behavior. You know,
Absolutely. Hmm.
born with it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Do you remember the parent who used to say, you should feel sorry for what you did? Well, I didn't actually. I was very glad I hit him on the head.
I love it. So if people want to talk more
Yeah.
about or learn more
Yeah.
about or
Yeah.
inquire in terms of engagement of
Right.
respect and
Yeah, we've talked quite a bit in the past about getting hold of us through emails and telephone calls and so on, and people do that. I've now come to the conclusion that, as you know, we've put together the worksheets. We've got the living schedule, we've got the living chart, and we have the living journal.
yes,
We have these three worksheets, which, in fact, I think you'll agree, work very well in a workshop setting.
they're a great framework.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
they really work because they allow people to ask the questions, they get engagement, they get conversation, Q&A, all of those kinds of dynamics. So what am I going to say to listeners is let your people know, whether it can be a service club or it can be a major corporation, but let them know that these workshops are available. And I'm stating what you know already, and that is that the cry for this kind of help is huge.
Yes. On
So
that note,
I rest my case.
thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Sarah.